I want to commend Deputy Farrell and Sinn Féin for bringing forward this motion. I think it's an important one, and there's no doubt that the freedom of information legislation is in need of review. And I welcome also the Minister's statement this evening and his commitment to ensuring that review takes place. However, I think it is curious that we're talking about a review of freedom of information this week, because given all that has happened over recent weeks in relation to the whole Zappone debacle, an excuse that was put forward by several ministers was that we needed to review freedom of information. And that was put forward as some kind of, explanation for why some of our senior ministers didn't comply with freedom of information. And I think it would be a mistake to get into that kind of mindset saying, oh, well, we need a review, the freedom of information legislation is problematic, and that's why it wasn't handled properly. That's not the case. And this shouldn't be used in any way to distract the mishandling of freedom of information request, as say, by both Minister Coveney and the Taoiseach. So I want to talk about what's needed in terms of the review in a few moments, but I do want to speak for a few moments on what has happened in recent weeks in relation to non-compliance with freedom of information. And this started off, obviously, when questions started to be asked about how did this famous envoy position come up for filling, the fact there was no transparency and all of that. And when Minister Coveney was asked about that and asked for records of the communications he'd had with and about Katherine Zappone, he then told us that he had deleted those text messages on his phone. And the excuse he gave the first time was that that was because he needed to provide storage. He needed to create storage on his phone. The following day, he completely changed his story. And he said he did it for security reasons because he had been hacked. Now, he didn't seem to realise that the freedom of information legislation applies to him as an office holder. And he didn't seem to know, which is, incredible, that digital communications are covered by legislation in respect of freedom of information. So the question then arose, at what point did Minister Coveney delete those text messages? Because if he deleted them after freedom of information requests went into his department, that is a serious offence. And we never really got satisfactory answers on that on either occasion when Minister Coveney came before the Foreign Affairs Committee. And it was because his responses were so inadequate and untrue on the first occasion that he had to come back the second week to provide further clarification or explanation for what happened. But that point hasn't been addressed adequately. If he did it after the request came into his department, that was an offence. If he did it before the request for the freedom of information request came into his department, it's at best it's poor practice, because there is a requirement on ministers, on office holders, to ensure that any records, digital or otherwise, relating to government business must be retained. So if there was any reason for clearing his phone, and it's hard to imagine what reason there could have been that would stand up, he was required to make a record of those and ensure that a record of those government decisions or proposals was retained. And he didn't do that. Now, his obligations are quite clear in that regard. And what is extraordinary is the fact that Minister Coveney either, didn't understand, in spite of being a minister for 10 years. And if he didn't understand what his obligations under FOI were, that is a very serious matter. And it indicates a certain attitude and approach to FOI, which is not acceptable on the part of a minister. But we never got any proper explanation for that. And of course, the other aspect of it then in relation to this recent saga is the attitude of the Taoiseach to FOI. And very early on in this whole debacle, FOI requests started to be put in. Jack Power from the Irish Times was one of the one of the earliest people to put in a request to the Taoiseach's department. And he got a letter back then, after some time, he got a letter back from the Freedom of Information Officer in the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment. And the letter was very specific, and Jack Power published the letter, and it outlined in quite a bit of detail about the lengths to which that FOI officer had gone to respond to the request. And, you know, he made it very clear that everything possible was done to try to identify whether records existed. And he said, his words were that he carried out a very comprehensive search within the department. Not only did he do that, but he also then carried out interviews with a number of the Taoiseach's advisors. And they said that there was nothing. Now, you know, questions need to be asked about that. How was it that advisors to the Taoiseach gave replies? Surely they would have checked with the Taoiseach himself. Now, and I accept that he was on holidays, but nonetheless, an FOI request, and particularly in the circumstances in which those FOI requests were made, are serious matters. So, did the advisors not check with the Taoiseach? Why was it so badly handled and so inappropriately handled within the Taoiseach's department? And again, we never got an explanation for that. Now, either it was seriously mishandled and, you know, inaccurate responses were given, or else there is a similar lax and sloppy attitude to legal requirements on ministers and indeed those who are advising them in terms of compliance with freedom of information legislation. Now, either way, these are very serious developments in those two government departments, and there is very serious questions about the Minister Coveney and the Taoiseach in respect of their non-compliance. I would add also that it was curious, let's say, I'll use that term, curious. It was curious that within a very, very short space of time, the FOI officer in the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment left his post. And you just have to wonder about that. But this whole thing just does not stack up and leads people to believe that this was, at best, a lax attitude to FOI, and at worst, a cover-up. And we still don't know which it was. Either way, it is unacceptable behaviour on the part of senior ministers, or any minister for that matter. In relation then to and obviously that, along with many other